Rebecca Thompson watched her twin sister's car plunge down the embankment, metal shrieking against trees, glass shattering in the darkness. Rachel, beautiful, privileged, engaged to a millionaire, lay unconscious in the wreckage, bleeding into the mud. Rebecca stood at the edge, staring down at her identical twin. In her hand, Rachel's purse, her ID, her 3-carat engagement ring. She had two choices: call for help and return to her life of poverty and failure, or take what Rachel would never miss. She chose the ring. She dragged her unconscious sister deeper into the woods, covered her with branches, and walked away. 3 weeks later, she showed up at Thomas Wellington's mansion door, wearing Rachel's face, Rachel's ring, and Rachel's smile. "Darling," she said, falling into his arms, "I'm so sorry I worried you." Thomas Wellington, heir to a shipping fortune, held her close, believing every word. Why wouldn't he? She had Rachel's face. She was Rachel, or so he thought. 3 months later, Rebecca walked down the aisle in a $50,000 wedding gown, became mistress of a Connecticut estate, and gave birth to Rachel's baby, a son Rachel had been carrying when the accident happened. A child Rebecca would raise as her own. For 30 years, no one questioned her. No one suspected. The perfect crime, until a volunteer doctor started asking the wrong questions. She stared at her reflection every morning for 30 years, perfecting the smile, the voice, the walk. But when her twin sister, the real Rachel, appeared at the hospital with amnesia scars and a volunteer doctor who refused to stop asking questions, the woman in the mirror finally cracked. The face she'd stolen was about to reclaim its name. The woman standing before the gilded bathroom mirror in the Wellington estate had mastered the art of becoming someone else. Every morning, the same ritual. Check the smile lines, practice the laugh, rehearse the memories that weren't hers. For 3 decades, she'd worn another woman's life like a perfectly tailored coat. But this morning, her hands trembled as she applied lipstick. The color, Russian red, was Rachel's favorite. Or was it? After 30 years, she couldn't remember whose preferences were whose anymore. The call had come 3 days ago. A volunteer doctor from Meadowbrook Care Facility asking questions about a patient. Questions that shouldn't have been asked. Questions about a woman who shouldn't exist. Rebecca Wellington, though that wasn't the name on her birth certificate, descended the marble staircase of her Connecticut mansion. At 65, she'd preserved Rachel's beauty through expensive procedures and disciplined routines. Her children, Sarah and Michael, now in their late 20s, sat in the breakfast room, scrolling through their phones. "Mother, are you all right?" Sarah asked, glancing up. "You look pale." "I'm fine, darling." The voice was Rachel's, soft, cultured, with just a hint of East Coast breeding. Rebecca had spent years perfecting it. "Just a headache." Michael barely looked up. "Don't forget, the Wellington Foundation Gala is next week. Grandmother's legacy and all that." Grandmother. Thomas Wellington's mother had died believing Rebecca was her beloved daughter-in-law, Rachel. For 3 decades, Rebecca had played the role so flawlessly that even she sometimes forgot where Rachel ended and she began. But that was about to change. August 1994. 2 identical faces. 2 completely different destinies. Rachel Thompson stood in her childhood bedroom, admiring the engagement ring on her finger. 3 carats. Flawless. From Thomas Wellington, heir to the Wellington shipping fortune. In 3 months, she would become Rachel Wellington, mistress of a Connecticut estate, beneficiary of a trust fund that would ensure comfort for generations. Her twin sister, Rebecca, watched from the doorway, wearing discount store jeans and a tired expression. While Rachel had graduated from Vassar, Rebecca had dropped out of community college to work double shifts at a diner. While Rachel planned garden parties, Rebecca counted pennies for rent. "It's beautiful," Rebecca said, her voice hollow. Rachel turned, her face glowing. "Oh, Becca, I wish things were different. I wish—" "You wish I wasn't the failure twin?" The bitterness in Rebecca's voice could strip paint. "You wish I'd made something of myself?" "That's not what I meant." But it was exactly what she meant, and both of them knew it. The accident happened 3 days later. Rachel's car traveling too fast on a rain-slicked road. Or that's what the police report said. What it didn't say was that Rebecca had been following her sister that night, watching Rachel drive to meet Thomas for dinner, consumed by a jealousy so fierce it burned like acid in her chest. The crash site was remote. Rachel's car had plunged down an embankment hidden from the road by dense trees. Rebecca was the first to arrive, not by accident, but by design. She'd forced Rachel off the road, then watched in horror as the car tumbled. But what happened next would haunt her for 30 years. Rachel was alive, bleeding, unconscious, but alive. Rebecca stood at the edge of the embankment, staring down at her identical twin. In that moment, a terrible clarity settled over her. Rachel's purse had been thrown from the car. Inside her ID, credit cards, the engagement ring she'd removed to drive. 2 identical women. One destined for wealth, one destined for nothing. Rebecca made her choice in the span of a heartbeat. She climbed down, removed Rachel's jewelry, took her purse. Then she called 911, but not before dragging her unconscious sister deeper into the woods, covering her with branches and leaves. When the ambulance arrived, they found an empty, wrecked car and assumed the driver had wandered off, disoriented. They never found Rachel that night. By the time a hiker discovered her 3 days later, severe head trauma had stolen her memories. The woman who woke up in the hospital couldn't remember her name, her family, her life. She became a Jane Doe, shuttled through the healthcare system, eventually placed in a state facility for patients with severe amnesia and brain injury. Meanwhile, Rebecca cut her hair to match Rachel's style, studied her sister's mannerisms from old videos, practiced her handwriting. When she showed up at Thomas Wellington's door, tearful and traumatized, claiming she'd been in a minor accident and needed time to recover, he believed her. Why wouldn't he? She had Rachel's face, Rachel's ID, Rachel's ring. She became Rachel Thompson, and 3 months later, she became Rachel Wellington. Dr. Marcus Harrison wasn't supposed to be at Meadowbrook Care Facility. At 58, he'd retired from his neurology practice to spend time with his grandchildren. But grief had brought him back. His wife's death the previous year had left him hollow, searching for purpose. Volunteering at the care facility filled the emptiness. He'd been reviewing patient files when he saw her. Room 14, Jane Doe, number 4719. Admitted in 1994 with severe head trauma, amnesia, no identification, 30 years in the system, and no one had ever claimed her. Something about her face arrested him. Dr. Harrison had spent decades studying faces, reading the subtle asymmetries that made each person unique. This woman's face, even at 65, even weathered by time and trauma, had a quality he couldn't name: aristocratic bone structure. A scar above her left eyebrow that suggested old injury. He began visiting her daily. She didn't speak much. The trauma had affected her language centers, but her eyes followed him with surprising awareness. Dr. Harrison started showing her photographs, testing for recognition responses. Landscapes, celebrities, random objects. Then one afternoon, on a whim, he showed her a society page clipping from 1994, the Wellington Thompson engagement announcement. Rachel Thompson beaming, holding Thomas Wellington's hand. The reaction was immediate and visceral. The patient's breathing accelerated. Her pupils dilated. She reached for the photo with shaking hands, touching the woman's face with something like recognition. Dr. Harrison felt his blood run cold. He compared the photograph to the woman in front of him. 30 years had passed. Aging changed faces, but bone structure, that was permanent. The distance between the eyes, the angle of the cheekbone, the shape of the ear. He pulled up current photos of Rachel Wellington, the society maven, the philanthropist. Then he looked again at the woman in room 14. Identical. Not similar. Not close. Identical. But that was impossible. Unless... Dr. Harrison's hands shook as he typed into the hospital database. Birth records. Rachel Thompson, born February 14th, 1959, Hartford, Connecticut. Twin sister, Rebecca Thompson. The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. He spent the next week gathering evidence. Old photographs from the hospital. Admission in 1994. Dental records. The society pages showing Rachel Wellington at charity events throughout the years. And here, in room 14, a woman with the same face, the same bone structure, the same dental work, but with scars suggesting severe trauma from the exact time the real Rachel Thompson disappeared. He needed proof, scientific, irrefutable proof. He needed DNA. Rebecca Wellington received the subpoena on a Tuesday morning. Dr. Marcus Harrison, representing patient R4719, was requesting a DNA comparison test. The legal filing included photographs that made her blood turn to ice. Her sister. After 30 years, Rachel's face stared out from a hospital ID photo, older but unmistakably, devastatingly alive. Mother, what is this? Sarah stood in the doorway of Rebecca's study, holding the legal papers. Who is patient 4719? Why do they think you're related to her? Rebecca's mind raced. Deny everything, claim mistaken identity, hire lawyers to bury this. But Sarah was holding a photograph of Rachel, of the real Rachel, next to a current picture of Rebecca. And even Sarah, who'd never known the truth, could see what Dr. Harrison had seen. The faces were identical. Mother? Sarah's voice cracked. Who is that woman? The truth, when it came, felt like exhaling after 30 years of holding her breath. My twin sister. Sarah's face went white. You never mentioned a twin sister? No, Rebecca whispered. I didn't. Because I left her to die, because I stole her life, because I've been living as her for 30 years. But she couldn't say those words. Not yet. Not until she had no choice. The DNA test was conducted under court supervision. Rebecca Wellington's sample, patient R4719 sample, and as a control, samples from Sarah and Michael Wellington. The results came back on a Friday afternoon. Dr. Harrison stood in the courtroom, holding the folder that would destroy 3 decades of lies. Rebecca sat at the defendant's table, her face, Rachel's face, perfectly composed. The judge opened the envelope. The DNA test confirms that the defendant, currently known as Rachel Wellington, shares 99.9% genetic markers with patient number 4719, confirming monozygotic twin status. The judge's voice was steady, but her eyes were hard. Furthermore, maternity testing reveals that Sarah and Michael Wellington are biological children of the defendant, not of the woman currently identified as patient number 4719. The courtroom erupted. Sarah's gasp was audible even over the chaos. Michael sat frozen, his face a mask of disbelief. But the judge wasn't finished. However, further analysis of patient Mawak 4719's DNA, cross-referenced with medical records from Thomas Wellington and his family, reveals something extraordinary. The judge looked directly at Rebecca. Patient 4719 shares genetic markers consistent with being the biological mother of Thomas Wellington, Jr., born in 1995 to Rachel Wellington. Rebecca felt the floor drop out from under her. Thomas, Jr., her oldest son, the child she'd claimed as her own, raised as her own, loved as her own. But the dates, the DNA didn't lie. Rachel had been 3 months pregnant when Rebecca stole her identity. The baby Rebecca gave birth to in May 1995 wasn't conceived during her marriage to Thomas Wellington. That child was Rachel's. Conceived before the accident, carried to term by Rebecca, raised by a woman who had no biological connection to him. Sarah and Michael were Rebecca's biological children, but Thomas Jr., the heir to the Wellington fortune, was Rachel's son, stolen before he was even born. They brought Rachel to the courthouse in a wheelchair. 30 years of institutionalization had taken their toll, but with therapy and Dr. Harrison's patient care, fragments of her memory had begun to surface. She couldn't speak clearly yet, the brain damage was too severe. But when they wheeled her into the courtroom and she saw Rebecca, something flickered in her eyes. Recognition and betrayal. Rebecca stood, her legs shaking. For the first time in 3 decades, she faced her twin sister, the woman whose life she'd stolen, the woman she'd left to die in the woods. I'm sorry, Rebecca whispered. The words felt pathetically inadequate. Rachel, I'm so sorry. Rachel's mouth moved, struggling to form words. Dr. Harrison leaned close, then looked up at the judge. She says, you took my baby. The courtroom fell silent. Thomas Wellington, now 82, confined to a wheelchair himself, stared at the two women with dawning horror. His wife of 30 years, and the real Rachel Thompson, the woman he'd actually proposed to, sitting broken and forgotten in a care facility, while an imposter shared his bed. "Which one?" His voice cracked. "Which one did I marry?" The judge's voice was gentle but firm. "Mr. Wellington, you married Rachel Thompson in 1994. You believed you married her, but the woman standing before you is Rebecca Thompson, who assumed her sister's identity after causing the accident that resulted in Rachel's amnesia." Thomas looked at Rebecca. The woman who'd raised his children, managed his household, shared his life for 3 decades. Then he looked at Rachel, the woman he'd actually loved, who'd spent 30 years in hell because of her sister's jealousy. "I don't—" He shook his head. "I don't understand. How could you? How could you look at me every day knowing?" Rebecca had no answer. "How do you explain 30 years of living a lie? How do you justify stealing your sister's entire existence?" The trial lasted 3 months. Every detail of Rebecca's deception came to light. The forged signatures, the lies told to doctors, lawyers, family members, the deliberate isolation from anyone who might have known the real Rachel well enough to spot the difference. But the most devastating testimony came from Thomas Jr. Now 29, he'd grown up believing Rebecca was his mother. Learning the truth shattered him. "I remember," he said from the witness stand, his voice hollow. "She used to hold me when I was little and whisper, 'You're my miracle baby.' I thought it was because she loved me." His eyes filled with tears. "But it was guilt, wasn't it? Guilt because she'd stolen me before I was even born." Rebecca couldn't meet his eyes. The psychiatric evaluation revealed the depth of her dissociative behavior. For 30 years, Rebecca had convinced herself she was Rachel. She'd suppressed memories of the accident, of dragging her sister into the woods, of that terrible choice in the darkness. She'd become so thoroughly Rachel Wellington that Rebecca Thompson ceased to exist, even in her own mind, until Dr. Harrison's questions forced her to look in the mirror and see the truth. The judge's ruling was comprehensive and devastating. "Rebecca Thompson, you are hereby convicted of identity theft, fraud, attempted murder, and kidnapping. The court sentences you to 25 years in prison with eligibility for parole after 15 years. But the legal consequences were only the beginning. The Wellington family trust was frozen. Every asset Rebecca had accumulated under Rachel's name was stripped away. The house, the cars, the jewelry, the bank accounts, all of it reverted to the real Rachel Thompson. Thomas Wellington divorced Rebecca and immediately proposed to Rachel again, the woman he'd always meant to marry. It didn't matter that she could barely speak, that her memories were fragments, that 30 years had stolen so much from both of them. She was Rachel. She was the woman he'd loved. Sarah and Michael faced an impossible choice: their mother, who'd lied to them their entire lives, or their aunt, who was the victim of an unimaginable crime. Both chose Rachel. They visited her daily, helped her with physical therapy, learned to communicate through her limited speech, and slowly, painfully, they began to build a relationship with the woman who should have raised their oldest brother. Thomas Jr. legally changed his name to Thomas Thompson Wellington. He spent hours sitting with Rachel, showing her photos of his childhood, telling her stories about the life she'd missed. She couldn't respond with words, but she held his hand and wept. In her prison cell, Rebecca stared at her reflection in the small metal mirror. The face looking back was 65 years old, lined with age and regret. For 30 years, she'd perfected Rachel's smile. Now she couldn't remember her own. She thought about that night in 1994, the rain, the darkness, the terrible choice. If she'd called for help immediately, Rachel might have recovered. They might have both had lives. Different lives, unequal lives perhaps, but honest ones. Instead, she'd traded her soul for a face that was never hers to wear. The last letter she received was from Dr. Harrison. In it, he described Rachel's progress, how she'd smiled at a joke Thomas told, how she'd successfully fed herself at breakfast, how she'd pointed at a photograph of her 3 sons and managed to whisper, "Mine." Small victories, tiny steps toward reclaiming a life that had been stolen. Rebecca folded the letter carefully and placed it under her pillow. Then she closed her eyes and, for the first time in 30 years, allowed herself to remember who she really was. Not Rachel Wellington, society maven and philanthropist, but Rebecca Thompson, the woman who'd destroyed 2 lives in a moment of jealousy. The woman who'd lived a lie so thoroughly, she'd forgotten it was a lie. The woman in the mirror finally told the truth, and the truth, after 30 years of silence, was devastating. 3 years after the trial, Rachel Thompson Wellington stood in the garden of the Connecticut estate. Her estate now returned by court order. Her speech had improved with intensive therapy, though some words still escaped her, but she could say the ones that mattered. "My sons." She pointed to Thomas Jr., Sarah, and Michael, who were setting up tables for a small family gathering. Thomas Wellington, now 85, squeezed her hand. "Yes, my love, your sons." They'd remarried in a quiet ceremony, just family. It wasn't the grand wedding Rachel had planned in 1994, but it was real, honest, built on truth instead of lies. In her prison cell, Rebecca watched the news coverage of the wedding. The reporter called it a love story stolen by deception, reclaimed by justice. They showed footage of Rachel, smiling despite her limitations, holding Thomas's hand. Rebecca recognized that smile. She'd worn it for 30 years, but it had never been hers to wear. Dr. Harrison, watching the same, broadcast from his living room, felt a complex mix of emotions. He'd given Rachel her life back, but he'd also destroyed a family, exposed a decades-long lie, sent a woman to prison. Was it justice or just another form of cruelty? His wife's photograph sat on the mantel, and he found himself talking to it, as he often did. I think truth matters more than comfort, even when it hurts." The woman in the photograph smiled back, frozen in time, just like Rebecca had frozen Rachel's life for 30 years. The difference was, photographs were meant to capture moments. Rebecca had tried to steal an entire existence, and in the end, the truth, like DNA, like bone structure, like the fundamental architecture of identity, couldn't be hidden forever. Some faces are too powerful to be stolen. Some truths are too big to stay buried. And some women, even after 30 years in the darkness, find their way back to the light. Rachel Thompson had reclaimed her face, and with it, her name.